Oh God, as we gather in your name for this, we are grateful. What we pray, Lord, is that for us that are here and for those that are joining us online, we're always after a applied type of learning or reflective style of learning where it's not just knowledge that we seek, but it's knowledge that becomes a part of our life to the point that it affects what we do, how we act, what we say, so that all this could be used to form the nature of Christ inside of us. This is our hope and our desire and our pray. We're mindful of those who are going through surgeries, those who are in the process of rebuilding from the recent storm. At the same time, for those that have just issues of uncertainty, we want to lift them up to you as well, God, our rock and our Redeemer, we pray. Amen. All right, so we're in chapter 5, but I want to kind of do something to reorient us for a moment or two to kind of frame again Tozer's writings, because Tozer, he's a product of his environment. He's definitely a product of the time that he lived in. So in the late 1800s, all the big seminaries were in Europe. Now we had some big American seminaries, but Germany was the big school or the big area. You had some schools in England as well. In the middle to the late 1800s, we have in theology what is called the rise of classical liberalism. That's actually the name, classical liberalism. And part of the tenets of classical liberalism was to demyth the Bible. That a lot of the Bible was seen as mythology or legend, and you have what is called the rise of the search for the historical Jesus, and to try to separate the Jesus that lived and the Christ that is preached. Okay? All right, so I'm not trying to defend any of this, I'm just giving you information. And so out of that came what is known as just liberal theology. And it rises middle 1800s, late 1800s, it's in all of Europe. By the early 1900s, it's in every American seminary. So if you went to Harvard or Yale or most of the seminaries were in the Northeast. You started to have a few that were starting to develop in the South. You would be exposed to classical liberalism. And that has its day until around maybe the 1920s, late 1920s to the early 1930s. Out of that the response to classical liberalism is what we call the neo-Orthodox theology or neo-Orthodox movement. Now, you've probably heard people in the neo-Orthodox school, Karl Barth, you've heard that name before, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. They're all heavyweights that are neo-Orthodox individuals. And what it is, it's the pendulum swinging all the way in the other direction, opposite of classical liberalism. So if classical liberalism is over here, neo-Orthodox is over here. And so neo-Orthodox, and you can get neo-Orthodox, wants to go back to Orthodox theology. That is the late 1930s. And so it really gets its headway in American seminaries, and then it starts to make its way back over to Europe in the 1930s, and in the 1940s and probably into the 1950s would be the sort of the main time of neo-Orthodox theology and flavor of the month, or whatever you want to call it. A.W. Tozer is a neo-Orthodox person, but he would be a second-tier neo-Orthodox. Karl Barth, Dietrich Bonhoeffer were the forerunners, and then so Tozer is swimming in their wake, but he is a neo-Orthodox person. And so what neo-Orthodox people do is, keep in mind, there's been 50 years of classical liberalism theology, and so they're critiquing classical liberalism. So when they look out in the church at this time in the 1940s, in church universal, okay, that's been heavy influenced by classical liberalism, they see the church in a negative light, which is in a light that says it needs to be reformed, right? Remember A.W. Tozer, first week we were here, we talked about A.W. Tozer. He is a reformer. He wants to bring the church back to something that reflects the early church. Okay, so let me stop. Open it up for questions, because that gives you another context, or just wants to remind you of the context of his writings. So a lot of his writings are the church ought to be, Christians should be, because he's wanting to bring people back to a neo-orthodox or more towards an orthodox understanding. So I don't know if that might be, thanks Shane, I appreciate it, and let's get on with it, But that gives you an idea of how that at least what's going on inside of his mind and his culture of that day when they're writing to the church. All right? I mean, just like in the Bible, whenever we interpret Scripture, Scripture has to be contextually translated. I mean, you have to see the verse, what's in the surrounding verses when you interpret it. You can't take it out and make it isolated like this. If we're reading a text, I can't move it over here and not pay attention to the surrounding context of Scripture. So when we look at a verse and we want to figure out what that verse means, we stay inside that particular verse to see if we can get insight from the verse itself. Then we get to the surrounding verse. Maybe then we look at what we call the pericope, or the paragraph, or the segment of thought inside of the gospel, or the historical, or the epistle. Then we look at the book as a whole. Then we look at the author, maybe inside their whole corpus or inside all of their writings, we get insight. Then we see what testament it is in, and then we see obviously the larger scope of the Bible. That's how we interpret Scripture. Now hopefully that's not new, because every time we do a Bible study and not a book study, that's how we start each lesson. We want to learn from inside to out, not outside to in. Because what happens often, and this has been throughout the church's history, is people have a tendency to take a verse out of context and use that for whatever they want it to be. For instance, eye for an eye. Is that justification for vengeance? Or is it actually a call, it's a call to stop? Which one is it? It's a call to stop, if you read the larger passage. But if I just take out that verse and sit over here, and Becky does something and I don't like, well, I got scriptural, this is, God ordains me to strike back, so you get in trouble, all right? So we don't want to do that. So, but when we read a book, same thing too. We just want to be mindful of the larger context. If somebody's writing a book today, 2018, about the state of the church, and maybe trying to move the church in a direction of some sort, they're going to write differently. Words are going to, the etymology of words change over time, and so I mean it's just part of life. So, but he's a product of the mid 1940s, 1948, 1949. It's right after World War II. So obviously that's part of the mindset that's going on. I mean, what really killed classical liberalism are the world wars. Because one of the tenets of classical liberalism, and this is I'm slang terms, would be, if we could all just be more kind, the world's going to be a better place. Just be kind. Well, if you go back and look at I know this is really going to be in some deep waters. Go back to your history books when you took, World History 101, or 102. Then you probably start with World War I. And what that did to the world, and particularly the world thought at that day, and the level of atrocities and chemical warfare and what have you, and then that really they don't finish that. They just stop it. That's what stopped World War I. They just got tired of killing each other. So they didn't solve any of the issues. They just stopped. Well, nothing really gets solved, and it's just kind of just fuel to get ready for World War II. So World War I, not coming to other than just armistice, let's just stop fighting. When you get to World War II, it's the same stuff. Then the same players. And, so it's, if you lived in, say, the late 1800s, say 1890s, and you experience World War I and the atrocities of that, and then, later on in life, you have World War II, there is no sense of kindness in the world. Because in the span of a lifetime, you've watched 2 world wars, maybe even been in, those, or relatives or whatever. You cannot come out of 2 world wars as the way they happened with this idea that just be kind and everything's going to work out. Right? Now, we've got a lot of distance from World War II, so I mean, it's not so much of an issue for us. But if you're in that day, 1948, 1949, you are aware of that. And then when you start looking at it on a level of theology, you get his writing, which is the church. I want to bring the church back to something that is orthodox, neo-orthodox in its understanding. 2101 Wildwood Avenue. So, no, where's the church now? As in its theology, you mean? It's going to be seen via pockets of geography. Obviously in the South, and you are heavy evangelicalism. And that's across denominations. All right. Now, some denominations might be a little more evangelical than others, but evangelical in the sense personal conversion, gospel's got to go out, people have got to be out in the world spreading the gospel. God, they can experience God. Very much orthodox, neo-orthodox understanding. But in other sections in our country, and in other sections in the world, it's not. It's more liberation theology, which comes out of a mixture between neo-orthodox and classical liberalism. The feminist theology, liberation theology, I'm trying to think, some other theologies, they're all tied to this mixture between classical liberalism and neo-orthodox. And they come out of the 60s, 70s, things of that nature. Orthodox in the fact of very experiential, but they embrace some levels of classical liberal theology when it's understanding of God and what have you. So that's probably more than what you want. And I mean, so it's not an answer of, even inside when we talk about these larger schools of thought like classical liberalism, and it would be fairly common inside of seminaries both in Europe and in the United States. It doesn't mean every single person was. Just in a large paintbrush, the majority were. When we talk about neo-orthodox, it doesn't mean every single, so it's just, but the majority of the people were in these camps, if that's helpful. So the church is, the great thing about all right, so I'm going to not talk anymore about that because I'll get down a rabbit trail and we won't even get into the lesson. But so, to answer your question, it just depends on where you're at, probably, what, geographically speaking. So.
Well, it's helpful because if I had just gone out and bought this book,
right.
started reading, I would have put it down because I thought he's really comes.
He can be, yeah. So.
I didn't
right.
get that, but explaining all of that,
right.
I understand.
Right. Well, so it's a different. Again, 1948, just like C.S. Lewis. When you read C.S. Lewis, 1930s. Okay. So and it's not United States, it's Brit. He's British. So he writes with that level of and he's very much scholar. And A.W. Tozer self-educated. All right. So it's not like he has been sitting in a. Now he spends all day in his study praying and writing, but he didn't graduate from 10 different schools or what have you and held a position of theology or ethics or whatever. All right, so clear as mud, right? Okay, good enough. So let's move into chapter 5. Well, before we do that, is there anything from last week that still just sort of from chapter 4 that is a little bit of a, or maybe a thought or a concern that you might have, something maybe wasn't unclear, and just all week you could not sleep, and it messed up your weekend. Didn't matter what they did on football. I mean, you just could not handle it. So I want to absolve you of anything that might be that struggle. Nope. All right, good. So let's go to chapter 5. So, all right. So chapter 5. Again, Tozer's calling for reform, and his understanding and what he's what he's advocating to the reader is this idea of experiencing God, that God can be experienced the same way that you would experience other things in the world. You can experience God. The issue's not a knowledge of God. There are all types of teachings and what have you in his day about God, the existence of God, but he's after more of a first-person experience with God. And for Tozer, what he believed is that once a person experiences God, then that would lead to real change in their life. So go back to a couple of weeks ago when we looked at Wesley's The Order of Salvation. Remember that little stair-stepping thing that we looked at? And we sort of broke down in segments what Tozer just speaks about generally, and that is that as people experience God through the Holy Spirit, it does actually lead to change of thought, change of behavior, to use the word that we like, change of heart inside of us, our identity, our nature. And so Tozer is advocating that because he thinks that is the stimulus that leads to real change in the life of a person. And if the person changes, or if enough people change, then obviously that will affect the entire world. If you want to change the world, you just change yourself. I mean, you can't change. So you change yourself, which then will be a stimulus to change other people. They change, more people, and what have you, on down to eventually the entire world change. So this is Tozer's MO. This is what he's after, and all this is based on the fact that God can be experienced, which brings us to the board. All right. So there's two major attributes of God. Doesn't matter what school of theology you're a part of. It doesn't matter where you were at. I mean, when you read the Bible, pretty much all verses can be separated into one or the other camp. And that is the two major attributes of God. First, not in any order. This is just one, A and B. One of them is what we call divine transcendence. And transcendence is just that word that's separate. Maybe another way of saying it is God is completely wholly other, which means it's separate from the world, separate from people. If this is the creation line, there's the uncreated and there's the created. And there's no way in the world that the created can ever be like the uncreated. Because this one over here is wholly other. Totally separate. All right? Now, the problem, if you go so far into this camp without anything else, you get to what we call deists. Deists are people who believe that there is a higher power, supreme being, whatever you want to call it, that's completely separate from creation, completely other than the world, than the cosmos, what have you. But deists, which separates deists from, say, Christians, is that deists believe that this separate, holy other could care less about the world and just does whatever that deity wants to do, and it really doesn't matter what happens. Many of the founding fathers were deists. The idea is that there is a supreme being, but sort of just winds the world up and lets it go while it goes off and does something else. I'm simplifying, okay? But this would give you an idea of what divine transcendence is. Now, there are scriptures. They're highlighted in the blue. This is not the only ones. Just want to kind of give you an idea of how the Bible talks about transcendence. 2 Chronicles, Old Testament, But who is able to build a temple for him, since the heavens, even the highest heavens, cannot contain him? You get that separate from. There's nothing in this world that can contain this vast deity. Who then am I to build a temple for him except a place to burn sacrifices before him? When you read the 2 Chronicles, I mean, it's talking about a God that is transcendent. In Acts, New Testament, the God who made the world and everything in it is the Lord of heaven and of earth and does not live in temples built by human hands. Same concept, just New Testament verse talking about divine transcendence. Now Isaiah, I don't know if you like the book of Isaiah. Isaiah is never one that had a problem with mincing any words. I mean, he just kind of, both Isaiah and Jeremiah, when you read those books, you don't walk away going, now, I wonder where he sits. I mean, he sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. And notice this. And its people are like what? Grasshoppers. That's very endearing, isn't it? So, I mean, we're the cockroaches of creation. So, I mean, he stretches out his hands like a canopy and spreads them out like a tent to live in. Again, all that transcendence. And the idea is that God is completely separate from the world. All right, somebody said something? Okay. Completely separate from the world. And there's a vast difference between the Creator and the creation. So whenever you read verses, you see these in Psalms all the time, prophets, New Testament, that talks about how God is completely other, they're talking about this attribute of divine transcendence. All right? So any comments about divine transcendence? All good? God's sovereignty. So if we were to boil down from, how do we talk about this particular attribute, we would talk about the sovereignty of God. That, God is the Lord. He is above all. Now, for the Christian, there's also another major attribute, and this is pretty much the opposite of transcendence. It is the fact that God is knowable. And God is knowable via aspects of creation. Some people say, all right, so some people go to the beach, some people go to the mountains, and they say when they're in those places, they feel close to God. Why? It's just geography. So, I mean, what is it? I mean, I've heard y'all tell me. So what is it? Those that like the beach, let me hear it. What is it that when you go to the beach and you feel like you're closer to God? What's going on? The vastness of the ocean, right. So somebody said something else.
Well, when I pick up, I shall go to the ocean, but it's like, who but God could have made it?
Right. So you see creation and you draw conclusions that are, God is wonderful and He's knowable, and there's a level that I'm connecting with Him through aspects of creation.
So it goes so far and goes back.
Sure, right. So, I mean, the rhythm of it, all right, so the rhythm, that peace, so the mountains, same thing. I mean, you see the vastness of the mountains, but similar concept. All right, so the question is, by viewing, observing creation, or people, or whatever it may be, there's a conclusion that God exists, God is knowable, I experience this God. It's easier for me to experience this God when I'm at these places. Or there are other things. Could be music, could be poetry, could be painting. Just things that we would put in the created order that somehow I'm able to connect with God through them. Fair? That's divine immanence, which means God is knowable. Now, just like there's a danger, if you stay so far over in this camp and you don't pay attention to this side, you'll get deists. This is pantheism. That is that God is only seen in creation. So if you can imagine, the blue is humanity and the black is deity, they're all mixed together. That actually a good example would be magic. All right. So when you read the Old Testament, there's a lot to say about sorcery and magic and stuff like that. Why? Is that because the Old Testament just didn't like Harry Potter and J.K. Rowling? I mean, shame on them, right? So I mean, or fairy tales, so Disney, right? I mean, every Disney movie has magic in it, all right? So so it's not just Harry Potter. No, it's because the construct of creation is that deity is only known by creation, and you can manipulate deity by learning the right incantation or pulling the right lever or whatever it may be. That's why in the Old Testament it speaks very negatively of sorcery and things of that nature, is because it's too far over in this camp and it does not acknowledge this aspect. Does that make sense? But these are the two major attributes of God: divine transcendence, divine immanence. Now, what Tozer is saying is that people already understand this, a knowledge of God, who God is, holy, other, what have you. What he's wanting to recapture is this aspect, that God is knowable, can be known, and we experience God because this transcendent God reveals himself in a way that we can know who God is. All right? Now, the best examples of transcendence and immanence is the handout, Genesis 1 and 2. So when we read Genesis 1, here are some other verses. So you got Acts 17:28, where God is knowable. For in him we live and move and have our being. Some of the poets, so you got this idea of people acknowledging that even if they're not necessarily believers. Colossians, he is before all things, and in him, and then notice his part here that Paul writes about in Colossians, all things hold together. And then you got Psalm 139, one of the best examples in the Old Testament. Where can I go that he is not here? Can I go to the heavens? Can I go to the depths? If I get on the wings and fly, can I go as far as the seas? Wherever I go, I cannot get away because God is with us. Knowable. All right? Ma'am? Well, no, I'm a fan of it. I mean, base my life on it. So all right. So when we get to Genesis 1 and 2, actually we have two creation stories. Okay? Do what? Do we not have them? Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, all right. Now I didn't put, all right, so Genesis 1 starts with in the beginning God created. And I should have numbered these. And because I was running out of room, I should have put Genesis 1, Genesis 2, but I think we're familiar. Genesis 2 begins with, it actually begins where you see on the back page where it says the little small 2, by the seventh day God. So it doesn't fully have a chapter break, but the second account of creation begins in the italics. The lighter color is supposed to be blue, but in my infinite wisdom and knowledge of copy machines, somehow it did not print blue. So, anyways, so we have this idea of Genesis 1 is written from the account of divine transcendence. Notice how each of the major segments of Genesis 1 begins with, and God said, right? And so you have this God who is separate from creation. God just simply speaks and creation exists. You with me? And when we get to Genesis 2, the lesser known creation story, it is written more from a relational understanding where you have God is knowable or not knowable. Knowable, right, because what does he do? He creates humanity, then what? He creates humanity in 1, bless them in chapter 1, 2. So what is significant about the second part? Helpmate, so that's still part of how, hang on, keep reading. Not just good, says that in Genesis 1. Keep on going down. And let's see. So obviously there's conversation, right, between man and God. Hang on. 2. Right. Oh, you know what? I've set y'all up for failure. Where does it say about God walking in the garden? It's in yeah, okay. Yeah, that's Genesis 3. Yeah, I'm going to have to talk to the person that printed these, right? So, so when we get to Genesis 3, which is a continuation of Genesis 2, not Genesis 1, that same story, you've got this God who interacts with humanity, and particularly the idea of walking in the evening. Well, what that's painting a picture of is that God is knowable, and God is with both man and woman in creation. All right? Yeah, they were walking. Where does it say that? Am I missing it? Verse 8. Yep, here we go. Thank you. So the reason why, the reason why is because I did not give you the right information. Yep. Verse 8, yes. All right, so in the cool of the day, so just imagine I gave you all of Genesis 3:2. So, and then I'll ask the question. So, what is it about Genesis 2 and the continuation in chapter 3 that kind of gives you this idea of divine immanence? And then you would say, he was walking, that's right, in the garden. He has a relationship with them. They're talking, they're interacting, they know each other. So when you read the second creation story, Genesis 2 and then part of Genesis 3, what you conclude from that is that God and humanity know each other. They interact with each other. You don't have any interaction in the first creation story. Right? There's none. It just says God does it and it happens. Even when God, so even when God makes humanity at the end of chapter 1, there still is no interaction between humanity and God. It just says, we're going to make humanity, and then you've got this Hebrew poetry, humanity, or Adam and Eve, and then you've got then it ends. It goes into the very beginning of chapter 2, where it says God looks at it all, and God rested, called it very good, and sitting back and relaxing on the Sabbath. There's no interaction in Genesis 1, that first creation story, where God and humanity or even know each other. Yeah.
Gave them all the plants and the animals.
What story is that in? 1 or 2? The end of one. Yeah, the end of 1. So, but then it could be just I speak, and that's it.
It's not walking in the garden.
Yeah. So if there is any level of knowledge or interaction, it's very limited at best, compared to the second creation story, where it just drips off the page, right?
Why do you call it the second story? It's a continuation of the first. Is it written?
I'm not sure it is a continuation of the. Right. That would be. We don't know. All right. So.
It's kind of like the last sentence, isn't that it hasn't been completed and the master.
Yeah. So at the end of chapter 2, or the beginning of chapter 2, and I'm not trying to say. What you have in Genesis, you have chapter 1 to this part of chapter 2 right here, is creation. Again, now creation. The Old Testament does not try to answer when and how. You do not. It does not even. It's not concerned with those questions. Now, right? Now we are in 2018. The Old Testament answers the who and the why. So in Genesis 1, who's the who? God. Now we don't really get why. It just is, well, when I wanted to do it, this is what I did. Right? one day, second, days all the way down. You get to the very end, makes humanity. On the seventh day, finishes everything that God wanted to do, rest from all of his work, blessed them, holy, and that's it. Now, in verse 4, now, Joanne, this might be a little bit to your question. In chapter 4, this verse right here is what sort of gives us a little bit of, maybe it's a second story altogether. And that is, it's a summary statement or an introductory statement. This is the account of the heavens and earth when they were created. Well, Genesis 1 already told us that they were created. So why put that in there? Does that make sense? I mean, and then you've got this idea of now no shrub, no plant. Well, Genesis 1 said he already made that, right? What's that, day 2, day 3, day 4, somewhere in that neighborhood? No rain, which means no water. So that's the reason why many people say second creation story. Again, it's not trying to say, well, the first one wasn't right. It's just written from two different, it's the transcendent architect writes Genesis 1. Anybody in here engineer, math, need to get Mary Lou Gerald in here. Mary Lou Gerald would love Genesis chapter 1. She's an engineer, right? And because it is technical, it is orderly. We got what happens on this part of the phase, that happens. Phase 2, that happens. Phase 3, that happens. Now, anybody here a therapist? There, we got one therapist. Anybody in here? Let's see. What's that? You need some? Yeah. So, what's another good profession outside of therapy? Relational, a mother, a teacher, and not just a teacher. It would be a teacher of English, and maybe let's see what else would be. Anybody in here a pastor? It'd be this one. You'd love that one. Again, anything that is relationship based. This part, beginning in verse 4, and runs through, you can continue it on to chapter 3. You get, it's written from that perspective. It's not trying to give you technical language. Genesis 1 in the Hebrew, incredibly technical. It's like an architect wrote it. Well, I got out my tool and I measured 90 degrees and then I drew a straight line. That's kind of like the Hebrew language of Genesis chapter 1. Genesis 2 is written from a novel. It's novel. It's relational language, and because it doesn't tell you anything about creating parts of creation other than just humanity, right? The large portion of Genesis chapter 2 is the interaction between God and man and then man and woman. Yeah, so same thing. You've got parts of the Gospels. Okay, so let me stop for a second. I just want to She said kind of like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's right. Yeah, so you've got they tell the same thing. They're just written from different perspectives, different angles. So I want to stop for a second because inside of our day, and this you can trace this back for the last, 80 years, 100 years almost. The whole idea of evolution and creation, that whole debate, we're heavily influenced by that. All right? So again, we're a product of our day, which means that we then approach things around Genesis 1. Most evangelicals who believe in creationism could care less about Genesis 2. We bypass it. We like Genesis 1 because what's that tell us? God did it. All right? And the days and the technical language and all that. And then we go to Genesis 3, which explains sin. Right? I know. Listen, okay. I know. All right. That's true. Correct? Roughly? We just read over Genesis 2. We like Genesis 1, go to 3, like 4, on down the line, but Genesis 2, not so much. Yeah, so we actually get to Genesis 3 and we really don't talk about anything other than just the, little bit of the serpent, a lot of the apple, and then all the problems that existed after that. But so I mean that's again. So 2018 people, we're always going to be a product of our environment, just like Tozer was, and so we have to be careful what we bring into when we interpret. All right? I'm not trying to advocate which creation story is right. I don't know. I mean, I can tell you what Genesis 1 says. I can tell you what Genesis 2 says. I mean, I can tell you what I believe, but I was absent. So, well, yeah, I mean, it's not an issue. Again, if you try to ask of the Bible questions that the Bible is not trying to answer, the best you can get is just educated conclusions. That's it. I mean, it does not try to answer when. I mean, the first word of Genesis chapter 1 is just one Hebrew word. We translate it in the beginning. Maybe the better translation would be, well, whenever God decided to do it. Well, well, when was that? I don't know. I mean, it just outdates me. And I'm not trying to be dismissive to it. I mean, I don't know. I mean, and I'm all right with that. So again, I'm not trying to say, oh, you need to kind of live in Genesis 2 or live in Genesis 1. That's up to you. I mean, your natural, you're going to gravitate one to the other. And some of that.
If you leave out Genesis 2, then there are none of us.
All right, so let's go to that real quick. This is, in case you're ever on Jeopardy, I would want you not to miss this. All right, so, yeah, there you go. All right, so Genesis 1, well, at some point we'll get to Tozer. All right, so Genesis 1, let God make mankind. Some versions, older versions say man. The word there is the word in Hebrew for humanity. Well, all right, so our image, the short answer there is deity. All right, deity, Godhead. All right, so and then here is when you get insight into what is called Hebrew poetry. Have you ever heard about this? Does this make a ring bell? Hebrew poetry. It's a style of writing in Hebrew this is why context is crucial. So this is the main statement. God creates humanity or mankind, either word, that's fine, in His own image. All right, own image. I don't know why it does this. So own image. Who's this? Yeah.
He will be in here in a minute.
Who? John? Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, he's not here. So you're stuck with me, JoJo. It is what it is, so...
That's supposed to be all blue.
No, ma'am. All right, so Hebrew, you interpret humanity. It's a style of writing. Humanity, them, male and female, all the same. It's called Hebrew poetry. Own image, image of God. The what?
Is that the word?
Yeah. Yep. So, and there are other times in the Bible where this happens, but this is a classical style of typical Hebrew writing where there's restatement, but there's restatement in different parts of the line or the sentence, and you draw your interpretation. I mean, literally, it makes a triangle, just like that. And so...
But you have to be adopted as another.
Well, you have to have studied Hebrew. So, right. But so, we lose this in translation. But this is, so the idea that says only a male was created in Genesis 1 is very much incorrect. that is a horrible, horrible interpretation of Hebrew writing.
What about the rib?
The rib, it's relational. All right. Now, to me, I think the rib is important because I think it's not the head and it's not the foot. It's in the middle, which means equal. 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 So, again, the purpose of Genesis 1 and 2 is not really to try to tell you the how. All right, it's just telling you the why and the who. So again, we want to be careful what we read into the text as if to try to answer certain questions that the text was not designed to answer. All right? Basically, Genesis 2 is really just every other animal, wasn't it? I mean, Adam, he brings everything in front of Adam. Which one you want for your mate? It's not good for man to be alone. So what about the existing animals? And votes them all down. So then calls him to sleep. Well, I mean, that's what the text says. All right. So I mean, so I mean, it's equal. I mean, it's one that they're together. And but the idea that I just wanted to point this out. And again, if you're ever in a Hebrew Jeopardy, and they ask you the question, was a female created in Genesis chapter 1? The answer is yes.
Guess who was on there recently?
A Hebrew person?
Tozer.
On Jeopardy? Hey, listen. Exactly right. See, no, he's dead. He's dead. His question. Yeah. So. I know it. Yep. So now that I've wasted this entire lesson, let's take a break, and we'll come. We're gonna hit chapter 5. Really, we're gonna be cooking after break. All right, so we got into a little bit of A.W. Tozer, chapter 5, about in the very beginning around the concept of divine transcendence and divine immanence. The bus is going. Probably not in the very beginning. So if the classical liberalism is from middle 19th century to around the 1920s, late 20s, on the front end, no. On the back end, probably so, because it's not like classical liberalism stopped in 1929 and neo-orthodox started in 1930. So there is overlap, and so as this is starting to rise up, people would start to notice certain things. It does all the time. All right, so we looked at two of the major attributes that Tozer talks about in the very beginning of chapter 5, this idea of divine transcendence, divine immanence. Hopefully it's not surprising that he focuses more on, he assumes divine transcendence, Tozer that is, but he really wants to move people more towards this idea of divine immanence and knowing God, participating with God. And that's part of the Christian experience, that God is here, God is knowable, God is not just something that's so far distant and removed, but can be experienced, can be enjoyed for the purpose of a changed life. Now, Tozer asked the question, if God is everywhere, or knowable, or immanent, then why do people not see God, or why do people not experience God? Which is a very fair question.
They think this just happened.
Ma'am?
They think this just all happened.
Well, I don't know. So you're asking the question from those who don't see God or don't experience God. How is it they could draw the conclusion that there is no God? Well, Tozer does give an answer to that, but I want to hold off for just a second. But at least the first question out of this is that if God is knowable all over here, then why is it that there are some people that either don't see God or don't experience God? Because, well, all right, so he doesn't look for it. Tozer says if God is present at every point in space, if we cannot go to where he is, cannot even conceive of a place where he is not, then why then has not that presence become the only universally celebrated fact of the world? That's a direct quote from him. Same question here. If God is everywhere, can be known, walks in the garden, then how is it that people can live their life and not see or experience that God? To shorten the question, how do people miss God? Now he does cite Genesis chapter 28, where Jacob, is a part in the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, where Jacob's at a place and all of a sudden he comes to the conclusion, gosh, God is here too. And I was at this place for a while and I didn't know that. But the answer is, just because I don't know God or don't experience God, doesn't mean that that people can experience God or that God is not real. Go back to last week where we talked about St. Anselm's ontological argument, which is greater, what people can conceive, or something that exists on its own, even if people can't conceive it. You remember that? Your favorite part of the lesson last time, right? So, and the answer is what's greater is the reality that exists, even if people don't conceive of it. Now, obviously, you want people to conceive of it. A better example, this is what we used last week. If Becky loves me, the fact that she loves me exists on its own, whether or not I can perceive it or not, right? Now, obviously, I want to receive it. She would want that to happen. But whether or not I acknowledge or receive that is not any indication of whether or not she's loving. She's loving on her own. So the same thing with God. But the question is a good one to ask. If the reality of God, that's chapter 4 language, does exist outside of conception from a person, then obviously we want those two to come together. We want that reality that exists on its own, and we want people to conceive or perceive, or to use a language that Tozer likes, to experience that God. Now, the reason, this goes to Betty's question, the reason people have not or cannot experience this God that is everywhere has to do with the fact that what he calls their spiritual receptor is not activated. That's change word there. Tozer believes, and this is classical Christian theology, that inside of God has created people in a way that they can and should experience Him. Because of sin, small s and big S, the ability to perceive or the ability to experience needs its own life support. So it needs to be jump-started, it needs to be fired up. And Tozer calls this a spiritual receptivity that sits inside of the person. I don't have the page number, so I haven't even given y'all the quote yet. Hang on. So okay. 52 is where he talks about receptivity. Mary Lou.
I felt like the earlier lesson we learned was that we are chosen by God to become curious and look.
Right. All right. So
So have these people not been chosen to start their search?
yeah. So
Or is it that they have
let me broaden.
control over their
Yeah, they have a veil. The chosen is for all people. Okay? The reason why people don't respond back to their chosenness, to use I think chapter 2, there is a veil, or in chapter 6, their receptor needs, the battery's dead, it needs to be jumped off. So same thing, just different way of saying it. And so part of the chapter, a good example of this in Scripture is Luke chapter 18, verses 18 through 30. That's the interaction with Jesus and the rich young ruler. All right, so the rich young ruler goes to Jesus and says, "What must I do to inherit the kingdom, go to heaven, be a follower, whatever?" Jesus gives him answers. What's the first answer? It's all 10 Commandments. Well, you know what's been written. You know the law. Do this, do that, do this, and the kingdom will be yours. How does it end? The guy says, "Thank you, I've got it." Off he goes, straight on up into heaven like Enoch, right? Just walks with God all the way, and we don't know what happened to him. No, right? That's exactly right. He turns away and he walks away, and then Jesus gives this teaching about the eye of the needle and the camel and all that. But the receptor there, through some level of choice, he chooses to not fire it up. Those are my languages, okay? But everybody has this spiritual, this receptor, the ability. It might be veiled, or it might be dormant, but people have a longing to know. And what Tozer says, the more that everybody, I'm going to paraphrase him. Everybody at some point in time, in life and in experience, there'll be parts of where the battery's trying to crank the car back up. All right? And when that happens, people then have a choice either to respond more or to not, to neglect. And Tozer says that what should happen, or what he's writing to try to encourage, is that when you put the black and the red on the battery and you get ready to fire it, is to keep firing it over and over and over. The more you do that, the more this receptor actually increases. And to use what Mary Lou was talking about with the veil starts to come off. And so you start to see God everywhere in all things and respond more and more and more to it. Or you can put the red and the black on the battery, and the healthy car can turn it on and press the gas and fire it on up, and you cannot turn your switch at all. And that's really going to help your battery, right? Have you ever jumped off your car? Hopefully not. I mean, and so you can neglect it, and the more you neglect it, you actually end up destroying the receptor. And so you lose the ability. The veil becomes more than just a veil. It becomes a chasm. And you lose the ability to respond to all the places where God is trying to jumpstart the receptor. Now, I'm mixing a bunch of Shane's terms into Tozer, all right? I'm not sure they had jumper cables in 1948. I don't know. Some of y'all do you have the history of jumper cables? Okay, yeah. So I thought they were cranking it up, so I mean, yeah. I knew I was going to get a little bit of something, so, but that's the concept, is that the reason why some people don't see or don't experience, and you can see the same thing in the Gospels. Some of you were with me when we studied the Gospel of Mark. You got to go back a little bit. If you want to go dust it off, it's archived on our website. The Gospel of Mark, one of the major themes in the Gospel of Mark is that there are people who should see God but don't, in Christ, but don't. And there are people who shouldn't see God but do. Same concept. And so what is it about receptors inside of a person that some fire, some don't? Well, he would say that as God is trying to resuscitate the receptor, there are people who turn their key, and then the more they turn their key, the clearer it becomes, the greater they see that, and there's some people who don't turn it at all. Right, so just because I'm not trying to give the answer of why they don't, there's a level of choice that's involved in that. I'm just talking about what happens. Some turn, some don't. Now, the effects of sin for Tozer is a huge influence to why people won't turn the key. The veil becomes thicker and thicker and thicker, and eventually you can't see it all. For Tozer, receptivity is the key. By exercising it, it grows. By neglect, it's destroyed. And this is where he really just gives us some insightful language. And I want to read this to you. All right, so this is my page 62, which is not going to be your page. So it's start from the back of the chapter and work back 1, 2, 3, 4 paragraphs. For the great sickness.
Okay, that's the middle of 53.
The middle of page 53. All right, you actually can go back to the paragraph just before that. That would probably be either page 53 or 52 for you, where it says the tragic results of the Spirit. 55. We have 3 different versions. This is awesome. So somewhere in between page 55 and 63. You will somewhere between 53 and 63, you will find this. So I mean, listen. On Tuesdays, and I really mean this. This is not the bless your heart because we don't care. I mean, this is a caring statement. Bless your heart because on Tuesday is the longest day of my week, and so I get up at dark 30. Because we start here, for me, I'm starting at 6:30. My first meeting's at 7:30, and it doesn't end until late this afternoon. So by the time you get me at 10 o'clock, man, my machine has been running on about 50 cups of coffee. And so, about 3 o'clock, I'm going to pass out in my office, anyway, so I apologize if that's out of line. Yeah, exactly right. Yes. Yeah. Keep it going, Shane. So, yeah. So, all right. So, some part, 53 to 63, you will find the paragraph that says, for this great sickness. You find that? So let's look at it. So why is it, now in light of spiritual receptivity, some do, some don't, fuel it or neglect it. He's talking about the reason why we don't increase it. For this great sickness that is upon us, no one person is responsible, and no Christian is wholly free from blame. We have all contributed directly or indirectly to this sad state of affairs. We have been, now this is where it gets kind of like, oh man, we have been too blind to see, too timid to speak out, or too self-satisfied to desire anything better than the poor average diet with which others appear satisfied. To put it differently, we have accepted one another's notions, copied one another's lives, and made another's experiences the model of our own. And for a generation, again, 1948, for a generation the trend has been downward. So think about this for a second. Now we have reached a low place of sand and burnt wire. I mean, he gives some colorful language there. But think about what we settle for when it comes to our faith. Compared to, all right, so here's a good example of this. And I'm guilty of this as well. In the fall of the year, what occupies your attention more? Your faith or football? It is what it is. It is what it is. Okay? My Saturday revolves around when Auburn's playing. Yes, ma'am.
Picture on Facebook that some people might have seen going around of the stadium.
Sure.
Stadiums with 89,000 people in it, and a picture of the sanctuary.
Right. Oh yeah. So I mean, and I'm a guy that will travel with the team. Okay, I get it. So I mean, it's we have the state of our faith that we desire, whether you like it or not. It is what it is.
So we don't want it to be more.
That's exactly right. The reason we have not is because we don't want it to be any more than what we have. Bingo. All right. So again, it's not just something that we struggle with. It is Luke chapter 18. You know what's before you. You know the law. It's just whether or not we want to do it. It's been my experience that it's not a problem with God. It's a problem with us. We want enough God to just get by. But if it means I have to be a Jesus freak, I don't like that. Well, I mean, we live into what we want. The question is, we just don't want that much of it. If God is both transcendent and immanent at the same time, which means that God has the ability to jump into our time and space and create longing and lasting change inside of our life, so either the problem is with God or the problem's with us. There's not a third option. And we have settled for the crumbs, to use Luke language, instead of sitting at the table. Now, if you want more of, then you're willing to do the work. And the work are the disciplines. I mean, when the average Christian reads a few minutes a day of the Bible and prays a few minutes a day just in prayer, it is what it is. In worship, do you attend more Sundays or miss more Sundays? So it doesn't have to be here, but I mean, you know what I'm saying? I mean, if worship is a discipline, if prayer is a discipline, study is a discipline, service is a discipline. I mean, what about the idea of simplicity? What about the idea of solitude? They're not permanent. You fasting. So it's not He's right, whether we like it or not. And I'm talking about myself, not talking about you. All right. I mean, there is this infinite amount of possibility when it comes to God. We have not because we desire not, which is why it's difficult to read. And if Tozer's right, and there exists this ability to receive that God has implanted inside the heart of people, and that God seeks, without violating a person's will, but seeks to jumpstart that then puts the ball in our court of how we will respond. Do we want to fuel it or not? Well, if we do, then you journey down a path where that gets fueled and fueled and fueled, you and God together. But if we don't, then we prevent God from working. So, I mean, there's not a third option. Now, that's not to make you feel guilty, all right? I'm not trying to make you feel guilty, feel shameful, or, I mean, it just, but at some point, there has to be at least a healthy, honest acknowledgement that if there are people who don't see or don't experience, then either the issues with God or the issues with people. And so at some point, we have to look ourselves in the mirror and say, why not? We have 5 minutes, so let me see if we can redeem it and make us feel better when we leave to go to lunch, because it's kind of sliding down, So, I mean, no more smiles. It was fun and games for a while, Shane, and now, for the last 10 minutes, not so much. But there always exists the willingness of God to jumpstart the receptor. Okay? Which means there's hope. And there's redemption. And regardless of circumstances, or regardless of past or even present state, that what sits with the whole purpose of death and resurrection, and the magnitude of the reason why Christ is who He is and did what He did, and for the effects of that, there always exists this ability for the receptor to come alive. And you cannot dismiss this. And there is this constant sense. This is where we shortchange God. See, we think God's love is very limited. We really don't have a clue of the vastness of that. The closest we get is in parenting. That's it. And it is a fraction of it. So our love for family, okay? It doesn't have to be just biological parent, whatever. Just love of family. The idea where you just are willing to. There's a reason why the pelican is one of the symbols for the Christian. The pelican the mother pelican will actually break up her own breast and feed her young in times of distress. That's why if you look on some of our stained glass windows or in other churches, you see a pelican. Well, that's why. And a lot of times the pelicans, the head of it's going down under the wing. That's the reason. So, we have some glimpses of this and how we care and love for other people, but it is nothing more than just a speck, a fraction that the love of God has for all of us. And so the will of God and the willingness and the desire of God will always try to jumpstart this. So wherever we're at on the path, you have to remember the love of God. It is not 1 or 2, 3 times and God moves on. No, it's not just this deist where God winds us up, gives us a couple opportunities. If we don't respond, then it's over with. No, there's this God that is knowable and immanent and constantly moving and interacting in our life and in the world in hopes that receptor will come to life. And the more it comes to life, to use the analogy of jump starting, God is constantly pushing the pedal to fire up the vehicle. You can't dismiss that. And you have to own that, and the idea that becomes, regardless of where you're at, okay? And where you were, where you're at, or even where you will be tomorrow, this God does not stop. Sure.
to live in. And that concerns me. But I thought, well, it's so interesting, in 1948, it was the same concern.
Right.
And so it's all relative. So
Sure.
to me, I found that rather comforting. It's unsettling, but yet it's rather comforting because I thought, well, they, no matter what age you live in, there are always distractions that
Right.
keep you. And the faster pace of things is always going to be so compelling. It's just simply hard to slow down and be still.
It is.
And present with God.
It actually predates 1948. The rise of the monastic movement in the 300s is because they didn't like what was happening to society, and so they retreated and went out into the desert. They're building cities, building cathedrals, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is just too much, you know. And so they actually ran out in the desert, and then if someone got close to them, some of them would even run out even more. And so it's to learn patience, to learn to slow down, to learn solitude, and then they would go back to engage. So there is in every age that temptation that exists. And there are things that happen in society that can become sort of a veil. And so I think I told y'all last week, if not, I think I wrote about this in First Steps this week, if some of you get the little devotional we put out on Mondays. You cannot harvest this year's fruit on last year's branches. Just think about that. You can't. Which means that this receptor has to be in the constant state of present tense. Are you with me? You cannot harvest this year's fruit on last year's branches. And that will be an issue for every generation at every time, regardless of culture or regardless of geography. And the heart of God will constantly seek to fire up that receptor and then to fuel it constantly. All right? Any comments, questions, or concern?
Just one thing, when we think about the idea of our choosing for our receptivity not to be fired up, I remember what a little boy told my mother when she was at Camp Joy with the children of Valley Rescue Mission, and she said to the little boy, "Do you want to be a Christian?" And he said, "Yes, ma'am, but I'm going to be a fireman first."
Yeah, that's a perfect example, you know. So, well, I think I told you one time I had a friend that his parents worked at a church that I was a part of, and they were getting ready to go to church. At this time, they still had evening services, and the son said, you know, was kind of protesting Sunday afternoon, wanted to watch football as a boy growing up, and said, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. That's all I ever hear about is Jesus. I want to hear about the devil sometime, you know. So, you know, same concept. All right, go in peace. May the Lord be with you.